Hi there, it's Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. If you've never been to my channel before, I give you tips, tricks, and strategies on helping you make the quilt that you want to make. So it's Saturday morning. It seems like it's been forever since our last Q&A, but then it also seems like our last Q&A was just the last week. So we are in a new location. We are in my sewing studio at home. We have a visitor who's sleeping on the Murphy bed, so we are now at our new location. It's still under construction. I've got a ladder here with my quilt on it, and we've just done a quick setup. I've got Taylor behind the scenes, making sure all the tech is looked after again. And yeah, so we're in our new space. Anyone here yet?
Yeah, you got 12 people.
We got 12 people here. So I'm looking on the list of questions that people were asking me, and one of the first ones was, what am I working on now? I'm still, my UFO that I'm working on right now is still my Judy Niemeyer 4th of July quilt, and it is lots of paper piecing, lots of piecing. I think I started this probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I was showing off how I knew how to use colors. Hi Sheila, glad to see you here. Just need a napkin. Probably overstretched as a beginner doing this one, but I am using my 30-minute timer, trying to do it every day. I think I'm probably doing it about 3 to 4 times a week. And hopefully sometime in the end of the summer, I will have this done. Next projects I'm going to be working on, one of the next stash busters I'm going to be doing is a fast and easy quilt with layer cakes. And I'm going to be working on a quilt for my son, Cameron. And I am really hoping that I'm going to get to the Meadowland quilt by Here Comes June. And that's what I'm working on. Kelly Hamlet asked about how do you choose needles for your project? I know this is a beginner thing. There's just so many things to worry about, and one of them is the needles on your sewing machine, and you definitely go through needles. The best place to start is either with a quilting or a universal 80. The universal one is a little bit less sharp than a quilting one, so I think a quilting one is better, but a universal is also good. The numbers, so you have 70, 80, 90. The 70 is smaller, the 90 is bigger. And the bigger weave and the tougher the fabrics you are working with, you want to go higher. So if you're working on denim, you're working on at least a 90, if not higher. If you're working on fine silks, you're going softer on the 70. Other than that, I don't think you need to worry about needles other than switching it often. That's the most important thing. You think because it's not broken, you can continue with the same needle forever and ever. But trust me, you should be changing your needle at least once a month. And if you do a lot of sewing, I would change it every time you change a project. So I like to change mine once a week when I'm busy, when I've been working on a lot of things. But I also change it if I'm changing from piecing to quilting. I also change it because I use a slightly larger needle when I am quilting. But the most important thing about needles is that you should play with it, because the type of thread that you use and the type of needle you use will get you different results. And that's just one thing that you need to do. So take a couple of different fabrics with fabrics and a couple of different threads with a needle and try it out and make some tester pieces, and then change your fabric, change your needle, and try it out with some other threads, and then just continue until you have sort of a library of references. And you can do it over time, and it will also change with different machines. somebody was asking me also about what's the best type of thread to use. And I have one machine that prefers one brand of thread and another machine that prefers another brand of thread. They're both really good quality threads. So it's all about experimentation.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Any useful tips for beginners in paint chip projects?
Paint chip projects.
It's from Jean. So
I'm not quite sure what you mean by paint chip. Are you talking about the small blocks? So just answer that and then I'll take that. Where's it? I packed a lot in. I'd like to hear more about how I made the center blocks. Okay, so somebody's asking me how did my last quilt, this quilt, I just want, how did I make the center of the blocks on these quilts? So these were just leftover pieces from the top of the quilt. So if you can see, there's a lot of half square triangles, there's a lot of quarter triangles, and I had pieces that were left over, and those I just sewed together to make squares. And then with the strips I had left over, I just made strips around the blocks. And you can see my video on 7 strip blocks with your scraps. I'll put a link down in the notes on what that is, and that's just how I made them. I just used all of one fabric instead of 2 different fabrics, but that's a really easy go-to block to make scrap blocks.
she responded, she said, limited palette of colors.
So what was the first part of the question again?
Let me read it. Sorry.
Beginner?
Any useful tips for beginners in paint chip projects? And she means limited palette of colors.
So when you have a limited palette of colors, it's about the pattern in your fabric and making them work for you. So just be attentive. I'm actually going to be doing either the next video or the video after that is working with templates. And just cut yourself out a square from a piece of cardboard. You can use, just cereal boxes or things like that to do that. And just take a look at what the fabric looks like between the size of square that the size of the piece that you're going to be using. And just try and organize them in a way that takes advantage of the fabric itself. So if there's something you can fussy cut in, or if there's a stripe, or if there's a polka dot or a big fabric, just try and put them in the best place possible for your fabrics. Because contrast is key. And it's not always contrast with color, sometimes it's contrast with pattern.
I have another question.
Okay.
Would you consider doing a Quilt-As-You-Go video tutorial?
I am. It's in the works. It just takes a little time to get all the pieces together. So some of my videos take months to prepare as you get all the samples together and things like that. And that's the way it is with Quilt-As-You-Go. So I will be doing one in the future because it's very popular. I've got a person that said that she's looked at videos of sewing rooms and they all have their fabric nicely stacked. And how do you do that? Well, this is how you do it. You take a cutting mat or whatever, and the important thing with stacking and storing your fabrics is you want to make sure that the shape conforms to your space. And so you measure up your shelf, you get the depth, and then you just lay out a square on either your cutting mat or a table or whatever. And then you find cardboard. Again, this is just a piece from a layer cake, but you can use cereal box cardboard or whatever. And you lay your fabric over top of the square, like this, and then you put your square down and then you wrap it around. And then you have your fabric just nice and neat. Now, one thing I will caution you about is Yes, it looks really nice and neat when it's folded like this, but the most important thing is that you can see what you have. So this is really not a good method for fat quarters because that's just too thin. I like to keep my fat quarters, I fold them and I fold them again, and then I actually fold them in thirds so that I have a really strong profile of it. So when I have them in a stack, I can see what this one looks like, not only in its color, but in its pattern. When it's very thin, you just can't see it. So you need to have it, you need to have a really good profile so that you can see it. And this can be any shape. I mean, I could have done this with fat quarters and just made it a smaller one. Or you can make it long and square. I know a lot of people use that cardboard for comic books, those inserts. But again, make sure it matches up with your shelf. Don't be afraid to cut those down or just do unusual sizes. And also look at how they go across your shelf. Like you want to be able to have, I don't know, 3 stacks or 4 stacks. Don't have it so that you have 3 stacks and then some empty space on the side. Okay.
Have you ever made a quilt just using orphan blocks?
Yes, I have made a quilt using orphan blocks, and I actually have a video in the works on how to make quilts with orphan blocks. It's actually very similar to how I make my Afterquilts. So the thing with orphan blocks is you just want to have a cohesive story between them. You need to have something to connect them, and sometimes it's you're adding in a color that's complementary to all the blocks, or sometimes you're pulling out a common color within all the blocks. But you can also do it if they're a common shape. So if they're all stars or they're all half square triangles, you can do it that way as well. But be watching out for that video. That should be coming up within the next couple of months. Do you have any advice for squaring up blocks? For example, I'm making a quilt that calls for 12.5-inch square blocks, and they aren't the same size. Some are bigger and some are smaller. Well, this is just this is a beginner issue that you have. We've all been there. You're learning the technique, and then as you get bigger and you expand, you find out that in one of your initial ones, you're off just a little bit, and that makes a difference in the bigger one. And sometimes you have the points, sometimes you don't have the points. So unfortunately, you just have to make a decision. You can either make them bigger, or you can make them smaller. You'll lose your points if you make them smaller, but it's not as big an issue as you think. I have a quilt at home that everybody just loves, but it's the first quilt I ever did, and if you look up close, pretty well all the points are gone on the outside edges. And it's a beginner mistake. You know, it's just the way it is. Some people talk about blocking, and you can do that to a certain extent when your blocks are not off that much. So plus or minus 1/8 of an inch, you can get away with that. But it's an awful lot of effort. And again, if this is a beginner quilt, if this is one of your first 10 or your first dozen, I would just not worry about it so much and just sew it up. But if there's sashing involved, sometimes you can just alter the sashing so that you keep the squareness of the block, but your sashing is just a little bit narrower. People with very perceptive eyes will notice that the sashing isn't equal all over, but again, this is your first effort, so be easy on yourself. Somebody's asked me, what containers are best for storing fabrics in your cabinets? The first thing is they've got to be clear. I know people you might be trying to recycle other containers, so they may be solid, but the best thing for you is to have clear containers so that you know what's in them. If you can't see it, you forget it, and you don't use it. So clear cabinets containers is the first one, and the other ones are ones that fit your shelf. We go to the dollar store and you see containers and you bring them home and they don't fit. Start off with your measurements and then find the containers that fit instead of vice versa. The other advice with containers is don't overbuy your containers, because you will want to fill all the containers and that just leads to overwhelming stash. I have actually put a limit on my containers. I use the what do they call it? Scrapbooking ones that you can buy at Michael's, and I have told myself I'm not allowed to buy any more. And it is so darn tempting every time I go into Michael's to buy a couple more, because it would just make things a little bit neater. But I know what will happen is I will fill them and I will just still have the same clutter grow, and then I'll want to buy a couple more. So I'm keeping my limit and trying to sew down to keep my containers under control. What is my favorite sewing machine to make my quilts? I really don't know much about other brands, but I have two. I have an old, like 30 plus year old Bernina that's called a 910. And I love it, just love it. I use it as my traveler, and my new one, my 750, is actually at the hospital right at the moment. It has a problem, and I'm actually delighted to be using it again. I do miss my automatic threader, and I miss my knee lift and all my fancy stitches and things like that, but my old one is such a workhorse. But I do love my new one too, so.
I have a question that actually goes off kind of the back of that.
Okay.
What is one specialty ruler that you love and use the most?
Specialty rulers. Somebody else asked me about what's my favorite ruler. If you are brand new to quilting, the ruler that you need to have is the 6 inches by 24, just because it has the most versatility. It can cut those width of fabric strips when it's folded over and just do a lot for you. But when you start buying other rulers, this is my favorite. This is 18 inches by 2.5. I just seem to do a lot of things at 2.5 inches. I mean, those are binding strips and block sizes and things like that. And it just seems to fit my hand real nicely, so I can control it well. But if you're making blocks, also try and use the block that is the same size as that you're working on, because it's just so much easier to trim up. But this is a 6.5, so I use that one a lot. Now, as far as specialty rulers by their very definition are for specialty projects, so it's not going to be something that you can use all the time. But right at the moment I'm using these. They're not meant for this, but I'm making these shapes in my Judy Niemeyer quilt, and this just helps me trim it up. So I try not to buy a lot of specialty rulers just because they seem to be just one purpose. I actually haven't gotten rid of any of the specialty rulers that I've bought either. They're in a drawer, and I'm constantly thinking up ways that I can use them in other ways. So I have one ruler that I bought and I have never unwrapped, and I have a big project that I'm intending to use it for. So it's great to actually spur creativity too. Like, here's a tool, how can I use it in more ways? So I try not to overspend on the specialty rulers. What are my favorite quilting books? Do you have plans to write a book? Ooh, actually at the moment I don't have plans to write a book. I'm hoping to at some point, but I'm just not quite sure what I would write it about. But I do have favorite books. I have a book right now, and I'm going to do a book review of it. I just unfortunately have been sidelined by other things in the beginning of the year on Gemology by Andrea Sang Jackson. So I'm hoping to have that by the end of the month. And there's really good books that are reference books. I like Katia Marek's new Hexagon book. Even if you're not actively making something right now, it can spur creativity for other things. I do like Uppercase. They've got a number of different encyclopedic books that I use for creativity. I like, if I'm thinking of a project and not quite sure, or I'm feeling a little bit down and I want to get just that spark back, I like to look through those books. I like to look through books on color. And I like to look through books on architecture. So specific quilting books, I do have a number on my shelf. I'm trying to think, but there's not one that I actually go to all the time. So that's not a very good answer to that question. I apologize.
I have a question. What are a few things you always take on a retreat? Lindsay is going on her first one next month.
Ooh. Good for you, Lindsay. My biggest problem when I go on a retreat is I overpack. One thing you should do, I don't know how many people you're going with, but you might want to just sit down ahead of time and come up with some common items so that everybody doesn't bring a big cutting mat and everybody doesn't bring an iron. So there's items that you can share. Excuse me, but I always bring, my very first retreat that I went on, I just brought one big project to work on the whole time. And I found that I got burnt out. Like, I just didn't want to do it. It was just too repetitive. So now I always bring about 3 or 4 projects to work on. I don't know how long your retreat is. And I always bring a hand sewing project. You know, one thing you must remember that a lot of people forget and will ruin the whole retreat is your foot pedal for your sewing machine. Sometimes you get packed up and you forget your power cord, or you forget your foot pedal. You can almost recover from anything else. People can lend you thread, people can lend you scissors and rulers and things like that, even fabric. But your foot pedal and your power cord are 2 things you can't recover from. So make sure you have those packed. Somebody wants an update on the studio. Well, we've got one wall painted. We're just working on the plumbing. Really, we're just working on painting right now. We had a number of issues with the landlord that we had to deal with as far as some what do you call them? Not leasehold improvements, but some, like the gas and the windows and things like that. We had a little bit of a flood that had to be dealt with. So we wanted to make sure all those issues were dealt with before we actually did the painting and the decorating. So we're just getting through it. My son has been doing the majority of it, and he's been doing a really great job. He's been quite impressive, actually, in what he's done, because there was some major drywall repairs that we had to do. So our kitchen should be finished this week, and yeah, I think we'll probably be finished within 2 weeks now. Now we're going full steam ahead.
I have a question that's on the tail end of that, kind of. Any advice on setting up a new sewing room? I'm finally getting my own space.
So a sewing room, think of your kitchen and the golden triangle between your cooking, your sink, and your refrigerator. So you need the very same kind of thought in place with your sewing machine, your cutting board, and your ironing. And how much movement you want to do. I actually have my ironing board on the far side of the room because I like to get up and go iron and then come back just for the circulation and the exercise. I get a credit on my watch, I think, every time I stand up and move around. Though my cutting surface is right next to my sewing machine, and I do like it that way. But depending on your area, if you've got a sewing room, you've got some luxury there, so you can do some really nice things. Think about your placement with your natural light as well. Lighting is so important in your sewing room. In my sewing room, I have wonderful morning light, but I do not have good evening light, and I often find I have my photography lights up just to give me that extra light. And I'm just right now investing in some new lighting. Storage, again, we were talking about containers. Think about what you're going to be storing your fabric in. I designed this this one, I thought it was a wonderful wall unit, but then when I started moving things in, I realized it just didn't work for fabric. So I have to make some adjustments on how I'm storing my fabric in this space. So think ahead, think with the end in mind. How are you going to be storing your fabrics? Get your storage in line with that. Think about where you're going to be sitting, how much you want to get up and move around, and light. Those are the really main things that you need to worry about. How do I prepare the quilt top for the sandwich? Do you keep threads trimmed as you go along? Any tips on how to manage the raveling and threads during the piecing process? So if you cut your fabrics on grain properly, they will unravel less. It's when you have when your threads are sort of at an angle, then friction and everything will help pull them apart. That's just something that you learn as you go along and you get stronger, and I would not worry about that if you're a beginner quilter. Wait till you have some skills under your belt and then start worrying about that. But the main way once you have your block, store your blocks, this is the good side, and store your blocks with two bad sides together. So as you're working around and you're moving them from place to place, the side where all those threads are isn't getting the friction and the movement attached to it. So you'll have less threads come off your work. When you're storing your half-made quilt top, always store it with the outside, the top, the good side on the outside. How do I prepare it for actual quilting? It depends on the quilt itself. A good quilt like this one, I will go over it and try and remove as many threads as possible. I think that's what you're asking. How much effort do you put into it? I don't sew with a lot of light colored fabrics. If you do, and the contrast between the light and the dark, you will want to go over that a lot more carefully so that those dark threads don't show through after you quilt. The darker fabrics like this, it doesn't make much of a difference. So as long as it's not out of control, you're fine. It's all going to be buried underneath there, and no matter how well you trim, you are still going to be going through and picking off threads, and it will be going on for, I hate to say it, for a couple of years as those little bits work their way to the surface.
Sewing scissors. How do you choose?
How do you choose? Well, there are two brands that I have that I can recommend. I have Kai scissors. They are serrated, and I have LDH scissors, and they are just straight. You've got to test them. You got to make sure which one is more comfortable for your hand. If you're left-handed, all your life you've been using right-handed scissors, but there are left-handed ones available. You also have to figure out what you're using them for. Are you using them on wool? Are you using them in dressmaking? Are you using them just for quilting cotton? So I would definitely invest in a good pair. Buy what you can afford, and as you get better, you can invest in better scissors. I think I have two that are left over from when I first started. They still have good edges, but I now have these beautiful dressmaking shears from LDH, and I have a set of 3 from Kai, and they're serrated, and the smaller ones that I use with my embroidery and hand sewing projects, and they're all different lengths. So I'm actually in a pretty good spot. I have this choice, but I keep them I keep them covered. I keep them in a special drawer. Nobody dares go near them with any kind of paper. I am quite religious about not using them for paper. I have a set of paper scissors that I just use for paper, and you just look after them. So you don't need to have a lot of scissors. Just keep care of them. And you can always sharpen them. Always get them sharpened.
What is your favorite music to listen to while quilting?
Ooh, I'm actually more inclined to listen to audiobooks than music, but I do have a running playlist full of upbeat music. I hate to say this, but Three Dog Night, their greatest hits, is something that I listen to all the time. I have greatest hits by Cat Stevens that I like to listen to. I went and saw Hamilton this week, so that's what I've been listening to is on my Spotify. But I do like to listen to audiobooks, and people have been telling me about podcasts, so I've been experimenting with podcasts as well. So lots of different things. And sometimes I'll just have a movie playing in the background that I've actually seen before. Sometimes I want to be listening to something that I'm interested in, but I don't have to worry about the storyline. So I'm often listening to stories that I know and I've listened to before, just to have that comfort level so I don't feel so lonely.
What is your go-to pattern for charity quilts? She's working with beginner sewists.
Oh, for charity quilts, it's amazing. I like to do just squares. I like to take, there's a, what is it called? Jelly roll jam from Fat Quarter Shop that I also like to do. I don't necessarily use jelly rolls, I just use width of fabric strips. I mean, going back to my favorite 2.5-inch strips, that's what I like to do. I make my charity quilts fairly simple. Normally my charity quilts are just a checkerboard of pattern, and I like to lay them out in certain different ways. I made a lot last year in my Stash Buster number 3. I must have made that a dozen times last year. It used up fat quarters, it was fast and simple, and but my charity quilts are baby size quilts. So if you're making something slightly bigger, especially if you're working with beginner quilters, I would go just with a checkerboard. Yeah. Because for children's charity quilts, it's so much more about the pattern of the fabric than the pattern of the quilt. Where is my store going to be located? Well, this isn't going to be a store. This is just going to be a teaching space, and I'm in Toronto, and I am just minutes from the Downsview Park subway station. Somebody's asked me about labels front or back. Well, that is my challenge for this year, to start getting labels on my quilts, because I'm not a labeler. So unfortunately, I can't answer that, but when I do them, I will be putting them on the back. Somebody asked me about, she was told that on the back of the quilt, you should be doing 1/2-inch seams instead of 1/4-inch seams. If you're just sewing together big pieces of fabric, a 1/2-inch seam has just so much more structural integrity than a 1/4-inch seam. And if you're doing it on the back, there's absolutely no problem with giving yourself that extra seam allowance. But if you're doing a pieced back, like this one, 1/4-inch seams are fine, because it's about where the 1/4-inch seams are and how many there are. But if you're just putting big pieces of fabric together, yes, you can definitely do 1/2-inch seams on the back. I think, I remember just recently watching a video with Angela Walters in it, and she was saying that too. But if you sew big pieces of fabric together and they're only 1/4 of an inch, there's nothing wrong with that. It just doesn't have the same strength as the big one. Everybody's asking about an update on the new studio, but I think I've already asked that. How do I store my fabrics? I think I've talked about this before. I personally store my fabrics by color. I put all my purples together, I put all my purple blues together, I put all my blues together, I put my blue greens together, etc. I have a handout, I think it's with the Color Theory number 3, where it's all the color wedges. There's 12 of them. So I have 12 boxes of fabric sorted by those colors. And I have actually a copy of that wedge in every single box. But then I have a couple of extra boxes. So I have boxes of solid fabric. I have a box of low value. I keep a couple of I keep all Tula pinks together because one day I'm going to make a quilt out of those ones. And I'll have my holidays in one. So I think altogether I have 24. But you may collect your fabric differently. So you may have bolts of fabric. You may have a variety of layer cakes and bolts or fat quarters or whatever. But I would still encourage you, when you have fabric, to sort it by color, because that's the first thing our eyes see when we look at pattern, and when we go to fabric, we're looking for color first, and then go down with the pattern. But if you have a fat quarter bundle, you might want to keep those all together. So the choice is yours. Personally, I have had fat quarter bundles that I've split up and distributed amongst the boxes, only maybe 6 months later to pull them all back and put them all back together, and then use some of it and then end up distributing it back through the boxes. So it's not a hard and fast rule. Again, do it how your brain works. You know, do what works for you.
I have a couple questions actually about thread. So what brands of thread are your favorite, and what is your most go-to color? I've always heard that you only really need 5 colors of thread.
First, my go-to is Orphan. That's the one I like the best. And it's also the one I won a beautiful box from Orphan years ago, so I'm still working through that box. Gutermann doesn't seem to work very nicely in my machine. I'm not quite sure why. I've used Coats, I've used a couple of other ones, but I've used Gutermann on other machines where it worked beautifully. So again, do what works for your machine. And I agree. I personally have beige, lime, sort of a rusty orange, and like a turquoise. I have black, I have white. And those are really the colors I work with. If I'm working on top, or I'm working somewhere where I think the thread will be visible, I will go back to that Orphan stash where I have, I think, 48 different colors, and I'll just use it for that. But the bulk of my piecing is done with those 5. So it was a turquoise, a lime green, a rust, a beige, black, and white. And those are the only bobbins I have too. So I don't have 25 different bobbins, I just use those.
There's so many questions coming in right now.
No,
Okay. Do you take pictures of your quilts for a picture album? I wish I had done that with my knitted baby blankets. I don't remember who I gave them to.
I always take a quilt at the end. I'm lucky I have a very tall son, and he generously volunteers to stand and hold them for me. But I wish I actually took more pictures in the making, the process. So I'm going to try and get more in the habit of daily taking a picture as I go along, because the story of making it is often just as interesting as the finished project. So, but I take a picture of every single quilt. Yeah. And I try to flag them and put them in an album on my phone as well. So when I'm with people saying, oh, I need to show you a picture of this quilt, I can easily find it.
What are the quilting projects / patterns you want to do?
Oh, I've answered that earlier, but I really would like to make a meadowland quilt. And the other one I really like to make is My Small World by Jan Kingwell. Those are the 2 other people's patterns that I'm really wanting to get to. Right now I'm working on the ones of other people's patterns that I'm working on right now is the Judy Niemeyer 4th of July and the Katia Marek New Hexagon Millefiore. Those are the 2 UFOs I still have in my bucket.
How far in advance do you plan your quilting projects?
Some of them are very spur of the moment. And some of them have been in the making for years. If you watched my last video, you'll find out that you know that I found a pattern that I started working on 4 years ago. And that's still percolating. I think I'll probably start it towards the end of the year, because now I'm going to, there was the old idea, and now I'm thinking of different steps. So I've got to take time to accumulate the fabric. I've got to take time to go into my stash and figure out what I have, and maybe have to go out and buy a couple more pieces to go with it. So yeah, so some of them take years to come to fruition. I pronounced that wrong. But you've got to let ideas do that. You have no idea where inspiration is going to strike you next. And sometimes you have an idea and you don't know how to implement it, but then you'll see something else that complements it, and then something else that complements that. And then it sort of all comes together. Quilting is a flat medium, which we add a little bit of texture to. So often what we're looking at are three-dimensional things, and we're always trying to figure out how can we piece it. We've got great ideas, but the piecing of it and making the piecing worth the effort is part of the design process. So some ideas just come to you like that, and they're all together, and other things, other ones you've got to think about a little while. So look at my beginner Bargello. So that was an idea that was percolating in my brain, and then I found the fabric, and the fabric, because it was so directional, really complemented the original idea, but I still had to massage it a bit and see how I could take it and make it, make the fabric do all the heavy lifting. Yeah. So
lots of questions. Tips for mixing bold facet florals?
So calf facet fabrics are very, very bold and very, very colorful. But the biggest issue with calf is that there's not a lot of contrast between them, because they're very, very similar shades to each other. If you take a look, if you remember when I was talking about hues, tints, tones, and shades, you almost always find them at that same part of the cone in the color spectrum. So you need to add in, if you're trying to keep the same color zone, or like them all shades, then you need to add some contrast with pattern. And since his is so busy, you have to go calmer, so like some solids. Or you can take the same colors and just lighten them up. So it is challenging. I find his fabrics quite challenging to work with because they're just so bold and beautiful. Tula Pinks are a little bit like that too, but she has a little bit more variety in her line, where she has some colors within the same group, but they don't have so many shades within it. And then she does a lot more with pattern within her line, so they're a little bit easier to work with than calf. Okay, so I cannot believe the time has flown by so fast. If you don't know, you can find me on Instagram and YouTube at Just Get It Done Quilts. On my home website, my website, Just Get It Done Quilts, I have all sorts of free downloads. There's the Stash Buster patterns, there's the Make Your Own Soccer Ball pattern, there's the color zone printout, so lots of good information there. So go over there, sign up for the newsletter, and feel free to download whatever you want. I'm constantly asked if people can download and share the Stash Buster patterns. Certainly, they are there for you to use. Use them in your charity projects, use them in your outreach projects. There is no problem with downloading that and copying it as many times as you want. My videos that are coming up, I have one coming up on layer cakes, 10 fast, easy projects to do with a layer cake, and I've got a sewing hacks video coming up with template plastic or cardboard. So keep your eyes out for that. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you to Taylor for helping me behind the scenes, and I hope to see you soon.
What's the web address?
Oh, the web address is justgetitdonequilts.com. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Take care.